So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about the Great Depression today. And to start, we have to start like right when the Great Depression starts, which is with Black Tuesday. Okay, so remember, we're coming out of the 1920s. Things have been amazing. The stock market has never been higher. People are buying all sorts of new goods. It's been a decade of opulence. People have been spending money. It's been an extravagant decade, the Jazz Age. And that's all going to come crashing to a stop here on Black Tuesday, which is October 29th, 1929. And Black Tuesday is the day that the Roaring Twenties kind of came to an end, a screeching halt. So what is Black Tuesday? Black Tuesday is the day that the stock market collapsed, leading into the Great Depression. Now, in a second, I'll talk more about the causes that led up to the Great Depression. Black Tuesday is really only one of those things, but Black Tuesday was an important signifier. So what exactly happened on Black Tuesday? So Black Tuesday, the stock market literally just starts crashing. Over 16 million shares of stock were sold in one day, really one morning. Really between the hours of like 9 and noon, that many shares of stock, 16 billion shares, which wiped out about $4 billion in 4 hours. So really between like the hours of 8 or 9 to about 12:30, we're talking like $4 billion get wiped out, just straight up gone. And so the way that happens is that people would trade stock, right? One person would sell it. The way the old stock market worked was you would walk around with different colored sheets of paper, and a person would come in and say, okay, well, I'm trying to sell, or another person would have buy paper in their hand, and so they would exchange it that way. And on October 29th, on Black Tuesday, everybody was selling. And if you're constantly selling, the prices of those stocks keep dropping, and that's how all of this money just got, just vanished, basically, just into thin air. It got so bad. This picture that you see on the screen right here is a normal day at the stock exchange. You can see people kind of like milling about. You can see the bits of paper strewn around on the floor. But on October 29th, it was just mass chaos. And it was so bad, and they were losing so much money that by about lunchtime at 12:30, they actually shut down the stock exchange. Literally just shut it down. Shut it down for the day. You can see in this next slide here, the guy up at the top cleaning up all the pieces of paper that had been just like strewn about as people were selling all of their stock. In fact, people were so panicked by what was going on that day that a huge crowd, you can see in that lower picture there, that a huge crowd gathered outside of the stock exchange because people were so worried about what was going on. These stockbrokers were no longer working, and people were just like standing around in the streets watching the stock prices continue to fall. And in this graph here that is up on your screen now, you can see Black Tuesday is just this massive, massive drop right there. And you can see how bad the effect was on the economy. That Black Tuesday was kind of the signifier. It was the thing that kick-started the Great Depression, right? That kind of, for many people, it was seen as the start of the Great Depression. By 1930, stocks were down as much as 30%. So just a few months later, stocks were down, and I'm sorry, not 30%, 50%, literally losing half of their value. And you can see that by the 1932s to 33s, it is a bad time for the economy. The stock market was at an all-time low, or at least a low for that era. And so the collapse doesn't just end with Black Tuesday. That was just kind of the beginning, really. And so how did this happen? Like, how did we go from the Roaring Twenties, the newspaper boys running around and talking about how great America was, and everybody having leisure time and buying new goods, and the new styles of dancing in this high society, like Great Gatsby style life. How did we go from that to this, right? To a catastrophic day for the stock market. So how did this happen? Well, let's dig in. Let's figure out what were some of the causes that led to the Great Depression. So you see here, I actually got rid of the outline, the normal outline, and I put up a new outline that just has causes right here. And so we're going to kind of tick through some of the causes of the Great Depression here. And this is not intended to be like all of them, because you can really dig down into this and even get more into the detail here. But I'm going to just talk about some of the big causes that led to the Great Depression. So first off, let's talk about the stock market. Okay, so we talked just a second ago about the crash. Now let's go back into the 1920s and talk about what was happening with the stock market that might have led to this crash or led to this problem. So by 1929, only about 3% of Americans actually owned stock. And so you might be thinking, well, then the stock market crash doesn't affect that many people. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is there was a lot of corruption in the stock market, various types of corruption. One of the problems, and this isn't necessarily a type of corruption, but one of the problems is that there was a lot of speculation, meaning that people would buy stocks with the intention of hoping it would go up, right, so that they could make money and then sell it off at a higher price. But the problem is there were so many people getting involved in the stock market that as they keep buying it, the prices go up and up and up and up and up. And that sort of speculation pricing means that those stocks are overvalued, that they're not really worth as much as this. They're actually worth more down here, but because people are buying it and buying it and buying it, the prices continue to go up. And that's dangerous, because if that creates a bubble, right, between the actual value and the value people are buying it at. So this right here is not necessarily that good for the economy, because all of a sudden one day it could collapse. So speculation, not that good. There was also virtually no laws governing Wall Street at the time. So, for example, if everybody in this class were stockbrokers, right? We could actually speculate between ourselves and create sort of a corrupt scheme where we would buy and sell stocks to one another and artificially raise those prices, and then sell it to some, sucker out on the street. And then when we pull all of our money out, he's going to lose money because the stocks aren't actually worth that much. That was actually a pretty common occurrence, a pretty familiar form of corruption on Wall Street. And so people were speculating on stocks. People were actually also buying land and trying to speculate on that too. But so the stock market crash, even though it was seen as kind of the beginning of the Great Depression, is not what started it. That is actually not true, right? There are a lot of other things that started. One, though, is the unhealthiness of the stock market, right? That the stock market was actually an indicator of an unhealthy economy. That crash indicated a lot of other problems. So what are some of those other problems? Another problem that led to the Great Depression is mass production. Now, mass production by itself is not necessarily bad, because that means that you can have a lot of a single item, produce it for cheap, and sell it for cheap, right? As you produce, as you can see on the screen, they streamline a process with Henry Ford and Fordism. You make all the same type of cars. It streamlines the process and makes goods cheaper and more affordable, so people can buy them. And so businesses were producing thousands and thousands of the same item, and the intention, of course, is to sell lots of cheap goods at a profit and make a profit, right? But what this created was a mass consumer culture, right? That people wanted to kind of keep up with their neighbors, and they're buying more and more and more goods. And in fact, America still really runs on this mass consumer idea. But in the 1920s, the problem started becoming that people were unable to sometimes afford the goods that they were even creating in the factories, right? They struggled to afford these new technologies like cars, radios, and things like that. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. So mass production can create a problem, because if people can't consume the amount of things that are being made by these companies, well, then those companies just have all these cars sitting on the lots or in these warehouses gathering dust. And so companies are losing money, right? And so that's a bad place for the economy to be too, is when you have mass production with the inability for people to buy those goods. So that's another issue, mass production. And we touched on a lack of regulation a second ago. So during his presidency, Calvin Coolidge famously said, "The business of America is business." And that really signified the ideology of the 1920s Republican presidents. Presidents like Harding, Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, they believed in what we call laissez-faire economics. And laissez-faire economics, of course, is the idea that the government shouldn't really regulate the economy, that the government should kind of really, the exact definition of laissez-faire is a French word. It means to let it be, right? To just let something exist on its own. And so for people like Calvin Coolidge or Herbert Hoover, the idea was that the government shouldn't really involve itself in the economy, that the market will figure itself out. And in fact, Herbert Hoover, when he becomes president in 1928, aligns, and really throughout the 20s, he had actually been working in Coolidge's and Harding's administrations. He helped align the government with the interests of business. And so the government had an interest in propping up businesses, and sometimes that happened at the expense of consumers. And so Republican presidents were eager to kind of keep the boom years going. And so they're like, well, we haven't really regulated the economy. The economy seems to be growing stronger in the 20s, and so they're like, well, let's just keep it going, right? Let's just keep not regulating things. Everything seems to be going okay up to this point. But in the 20s, we also see a rise in wealth inequality. So there was an increasing concentration of wealth in the upper class during the 1920s. So there was a increasing gap between the rich and the poor, basically, in American society. To give you an idea, you can see on this graph right here that the wealthy are getting wealthier here, and now everybody, in some cases, is increasing, right? Like you got some of the middle class here that seems to be doing okay, but the poor here are not doing very well. In fact, you got this second poorest fifth that seems to be decreasing during the 1920s. But check out these numbers right here. So between 1923 and 1929, worker output increased from 32% to 62%. So that means that workers are more efficient. They're creating more and more goods, and they're doing a better and better job of it. Yet, wages only went up 8%. Right, so workers are more efficient at making goods, which means businesses are, in the 20s, doing better at selling those goods, but they're not paying their workers. And so the result is that all those profits are going to the wealthy. They're going to the business owners or the people who have invested in those businesses. And so the result is that by 1929, the same year the stock market crashes, the top 0.1% of American society in terms of like economic class had as much wealth as the bottom 42. That is a staggering amount of economic inequality. And to make matters worse, presidents like Calvin Coolidge decided that it would be a good idea to cut taxes on the rich. The reason being is he figured that if we cut taxes for the rich, that the rich will then take that money, put it back into the economy, and people will benefit from things like jobs, right? Job creation. This is an argument the Republican Party still uses today. You'll often hear it referred to as like the job creator argument. The government also in the 1920s was very hostile towards labor unions, and so unions were cracked down on during the 20s. They were, accused of being communist and these sorts of things. And so in a way, the 20s was a bad environment for workers. It was the wealthy that were viewed as critical for the economy rather than the working class. And so workers, because of this wealth inequality, are struggling to purchase goods, right? Even they're making the good in the factory, but they can't buy it outside of the factory. They can't actually buy what they're making. And so businesses by the end of the 20s are starting to struggle to sell goods because the economy starts to slow down by the end of the 1920s. And the last thing we're going to talk about here is consumer borrowing. So because of all these goods these new technologies that are being created, like vacuum cleaners, radios, automobiles, people see their neighbors buying them and they want to keep up, right? They want, just like you and I want the new iPhone or whatever, people want to own things as kind of like a cultural signifier in a way, perhaps a wealth signifier. And so if you can't buy something right now with cash, you put it on credit. And credit existed back then too. Now they didn't have like the electronic cards and things like we do, but they still bought things on credit. So you would just go to a store, buy it on credit, pay them back later. Many people bought things on installment plans where you pay it over, a month-to-month basis. Mostly buying new technologies, like you see in the picture here, people buying automobiles. This also, though, extended to farmers, actually. This is not just city folks. People out in the farms are also going into debt to buy things like steam plows or combines, big pieces of farm equipment that will make their life easier, but that costs a lot of money up front. So to give you some numbers here, now you don't need to know these numbers, but I just want to give you an idea of how much borrowing we're talking about. So 3 out of 5 cars that were purchased in the 1920s were bought on credit. 80% of radios were bought on credit. Now I know, like, to us, like a radio, nobody even goes to the store just to buy a simple radio anymore. But back then there were these big devices that really allowed you to key into the nation, right? It was a way for people to be involved politically, socially. The idea behind radio, what made it really fascinating was that, and I might have covered this in the 20s a little bit, but you could be listening to the same radio broadcast in New York that someone else is listening to in Los Angeles, that someone else is listening to in like Des Moines, Iowa, right? And so there's like this national culture that is created through radio. So people wanted to buy it, but they're buying it on credit. To give you some more numbers here, again, you don't need to know them, but in 1925, there was $1.38 billion worth of installment debt, meaning like people in debt on credit. 1.38 billion. Just 4 years later, 1929, that had doubled to $3 billion in credit debt. So a lot of people were in debt, except for the fabulously wealthy, right? They could afford anything, but a lot of Americans are in debt because they're borrowing to try to kind of keep up with their neighbors. And there was also a mentality that we call today kind of like the get-rich-quick idea. That was very popular back in the 1920s, this idea that you could get rich quick. And John J. Raskob, who was the chairman of General Motors, right, a car seller, gave an interview, in fact, where he said everybody ought to be rich. And he had a number of opinions about how people could get rich. He encouraged people to borrow and then use that money that they've borrowed to get into the producing industry. And you can see some of his quotes here. He says, "In my opinion, the wealth of the country is bound to increase at a very rapid rate." So he's like, dude, it's going up, right? The economy is going to keep going up. Ironically, this interview was given in 1929, just literally, I think, 4 months before the crash of the stock market. So not great timing. But he went further in this interview. He said, "Without the facility for going into debt or the facility for the consumers getting credit, this great addition to wealth might never have taken place, and certainly not for many years to come. Debt may be a burden, but it is more likely to be an incentive." And so he's saying, like, look, this system of credit that we have created has literally produced wealth. It gives people more money to spend, and so it's an incentive to get involved in the economy. And then the last quote there, "The great wealth of this country has been gained by the forces of production and consumption pushing each other for supremacy. The personal fortunes of this country have been made not by saving but by producing." So he's like, look, don't save your money. That's how old people did it, right? You need to get involved in the production economy, right? Spend your money. Be a consumer. This is the message that was getting sent by a very notable man, a very famous man in the summer of 1929, right? Literally months before the stock market crashes. And so you see in this next image here, a graph of consumer borrowing during the 20s. And you can see how in the early 20s, it's just a few billion. And then by the time you get to 1929, like all told, consumer borrowing is up to about $8 billion. Just an incredible amount of debt, all gathered in one decade. Incredible. So, what's the moral of the story here? Let's do an overview. So an overview is that in the 1920s, while everything actually seemed really good, it actually really wasn't good. There was rampant borrowing, mass production, this wealth inequality, and what all of that created was an unhealthy economy below the surface, right? Above the surface, everything seemed fine because everybody's buying cars and radios and things seemed great, but below the surface, things were not so good. And when the stock market crashed, that kind of lit the fuse and sent the whole economy into a tailspin. the way that happened, like why did the stock market do this? Well, people were taking out credit to buy stocks. This is just one example of how this would happen. So if you're buying stocks on credit, your credit has to come from somewhere. It comes from a bank. Like a bank gives you a loan, you take that money, and then you go invest in the stock market. So when the stock market crashes, everybody's losing money, including the banks, right? The banks are also invested in the stock market. And so when the banks start losing money, they hop on the phone and start calling the people that they've loaned money, right? So if you took out credit and bought stocks, the bank might call you and be like, hey, we need you to pay your loans. Like, we're losing money. Well, if you spent all that money in the stock market and the stock market crashed, you don't have that money anymore. And so banks themselves are losing money. And in this picture here, you can see all of these folks gathered around this bank door. This was called a run on the bank. And what that means is that if people found out that a bank was running out of money, they would rush, literally in a mob, to the bank to try to pull all of their money out. Because once the money was gone from a bank, that was it. It's not like today where your money is guaranteed by the government. There was no fail-safe for people back in the 20s. If the bank lost all of its money and went under, and you had money in that bank and you didn't pull it out, like, tough luck, man. That was just the way it went. And so you could literally lose everything. And that's a bad situation when people can't trust the banking industry. So these runs on the banks really illustrate kind of the hysteria of the early Great Depression, as people are kind of like freaking out about what's happening in the country. Okay, so now that we have an idea of like how the Great Depression started and what were some of the mechanisms that caused the Great Depression, let's look at how people responded to it. So this is Herbert Hoover. He is a Republican president. So Herbert Hoover, he was elected in 1928. First year, 1929. He was inaugurated in 1929. So he is in power for less than a year when the stock market crashes. Now, let's talk a little bit about who Hoover is, just to give you kind of an idea. So he had never held elected office before. He had worked for the government before. He had been in Harding's and in Coolidge's administrations as the position that he held was called the Commerce Secretary. But before that, like way back in his early life, he was orphaned, grew up with a family of Quakers that took him in after he was orphaned. And he was kind of a self-made man in a lot of ways. He was, grew up impoverished and then went to Stanford and did well in school, became an engineer, and then eventually just like worked his way up to working for the government. And so he was like very driven, very intelligent, and that seemed like the perfect message for the 1920s, right? This guy who had come from nothing, now he was the president. And so that seemed like the perfect thing for the 1920s. And in his inaugural address, his first day as president, he said a very famous quote, and he said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." That's an incredible idea, right? That we are about to beat poverty, right? That it's about to be no more poverty. That's what people thought in the late 1920s. Literally 8 months later, right after that speech, the stock market crashes. Yikes. So how does Hoover deal with this? Like, how does he respond? Not very well is the answer. Hoover really struggled to respond to the Great Depression. First, when the stock market crashes, Hoover kind of had this idea of like, it'll be over in like 6 months, no big deal. And then, of course, the Depression lingers and things get worse, and 6 months passes, and all of a sudden, it seems like this thing is going to stick around for a while, and people start beginning to wonder, does the president really know what he's talking about? Especially as the Depression lingered on and on, 6 months to a year to 2 years, people start to distrust him. So let's look at kind of how his responses went in order. So his early responses were just rugged individualism. Now, what does that mean? Rugged individualism is a very American idea. As you can see, you've got the flag here. And if you don't know who this is John Wayne. He's an old Western cowboy actor, very famous for playing gruff, very like overtly manly characters. And so the idea of rugged individualism is that you're responsible for yourself and your family, right? That you as an individual are responsible for yourself. It's not the government's job to take care of you. It's not the, your community's job to make sure you're okay. It is on you. So that means that during the Depression, Hoover was saying the government, it's not our job to get involved, right? This is not a government problem. This is an individual problem. And so he kind of leaned on cities or states or towns to help people. Rather, he didn't want to get the government involved in fixing the Depression, which already shows you that he's underestimating how bad this thing is going to get, right? He doesn't realize, and perhaps that's a little bit, unfair to say that because no one can see the future, but as the Depression worsened, this idea that like, hey, it's your fault, or at the very least, like, you're responsible for yourself, it comes across as a little callous, right? A little uncaring. He instead of helping individual people or individual families, Hoover starts helping businesses, right? Remember, they're coming out of the 1920s where they viewed the wealthy and they viewed big businesses as the drivers of the economy. And so Hoover's initial response with this rugged individualism stuff is like, you individual people need to help yourselves, but we're going to help businesses because they might provide jobs for you individuals, right? So they're still kind of keeping with this 1920s mentality that we need to empower businesses rather than extending a helping hand to individual people and families. So Hoover's going to rely a lot on charities, private charities, right? Bread lines begin to appear. If you're not familiar with what a bread line is, it's literally a place where you would go if you were hungry, you didn't have any food, and you would go there and wait, and you would get bread. Or there were soup lines, soup kitchens, right? Places where poor people who didn't have jobs, couldn't afford to pay for food, could go and get a meal that day. And I love this picture right here because it shows you the line here of people waiting to get bread. And then, of course, behind them is a very iconic billboard saying it's the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And yet, a bread line right in front of it. Same thing, unemployment lines, right? If you didn't have money, if you didn't have a job, the idea was that it's on you to go get one. And so you had to go to a charity or some place that might have work for the day. Usually it was just like day labor, right? Something that you could do for an afternoon to try to make some money. But you can see how many people are in this unemployment line, right? It's probably hundreds of people long. Difficult to find jobs in an era where there just aren't any jobs. And so, kind of to boil down the idea of rugged individualism, it's that you're responsible for yourself and your family. The government is not going to help you. And if you do need help, you're going to have to rely on charity, right? So the government will not be coming, is the kind of the summary, the conclusion. So what else does Hoover do? Hoover also passes the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Okay, so as you can see on the picture here, this is Congressman Willis Hawley right here, and this is Senator Reed Smoot. And they pass a bill, or they're the sponsors of a bill called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And Hoover signs it, even though it's not super popular, right? Even some people in Hoover's administration weren't big fans of this tariff. So what does this tariff do? Well, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, right? You guys know that. And so this tariff that we're talking about right here, the Smoot-Hawley, imposed the highest tariffs ever up to that point. Over 20,000 goods fell underneath this tariff. So it put a tax on 20,000 imported goods, and the tax was as high as 40 to 60%. So we're talking a really high tax on imported goods. Now, the purpose behind the tariff is to protect industry and agriculture, right? You put a tariff on things that are coming in from other countries. That way you encourage people to buy American, right? That's the idea. But that's not really how it worked out. What ended up happening was that other countries put up tariffs, right? Canada, for example, put up a bunch of tariffs against American goods. And so now you have countries that aren't trading with one another, and they're having to rely on their own home economy. And that's not always good, right? That can jack up prices. And so there's this huge drop off in global trade. Countries are kind of like not trusting each other because there's kind of like this isolationism going on in the U.S. The Smoot-Hawley tariff really signifies the U.S. kind of pulling itself back to that isolationism of the pre-World War I era, not wanting to get involved with other countries. And in this case, it's about trade, right? Not wanting to trade with other countries, or at the very least trying to protect its economy. But to give you a numbers example here of how badly this affected the trade. So in 1929, there was $72 billion of global trade. And by 1932, that was down to $20 billion, right? So the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was passed in 1930, led to a significant decline in trade, which, again, not good for an economy that's already struggling, right? And this was a global depression. It wasn't just in the U.S. Other countries are struggling as well. And so when the U.S. kind of like clamped down on its goods and said, we're not buying any of your outside goods, other countries did the same. And so then everybody's kind of like struggling internally rather than trying to trade their way out of it. So that the idea behind Smoot-Hawley is something that we call protectionism. That if you put high tariffs and you protect American goods, it will protect the American economy. And tariffs work sometimes, but often don't. But it's a delicate balance there. Okay, what else happened under Hoover? So Hoovervilles started to come up. Now, remember, Hoover was a self-made man, right? I just talked a minute ago about how Hoover was seen as this self-made, guy, came from a poor background, and now he's the president. But during the Great Depression, his rugged individualism and his, he attended Stanford, which is a really great school. That image is actually now starting to hurt him. He is now often depicted as uncaring or indifferent to the struggles of average Americans. And so, what is a Hooverville? Well, a Hooverville was a shanty town, like a slum, basically. They often existed on the outskirts of big cities like New York and Chicago, very close, as you can see, to some railroad tracks. The reason why you'd want to be close to railroads is if you're living in this kind of hobo community here, and you heard that, hey, maybe there's a job up in Minneapolis, you hop on the train and you try to get there. So people would live in these big hobo communities, and it's mostly male population. There were families occasionally, but it's often just men, and it's very transient. People come and go out of these homeless communities, using the railroad for transport all around the country. They called it riding the rails, trying to get to a place where there was jobs, things that they could do. And they're called Hoovervilles because of Herbert Hoover, right, the president. People looked at Hoovervilles, and they named it after him, right, as a way of blaming him, right? Like, this is your fault, President Hoover. You're the one who is doing this to us. And so Hoovervilles start cropping up all around the country, illustrating that people are really struggling, right? That people literally are losing housing. They're having to build these, I got another picture here, these little shanty towns. They're obviously the housing is not going to be adequate, right? They're going to be just thrown together using whatever kind of materials were around. And one story that involves a Hooverville, and probably I think the turning point for, aside from the actual crash of the stock market, a turning point for Hoover as president was the Bonus Army. So this is 1932, and by 1932, the Depression had really cemented itself in American society. What I mean by that is that the Depression had settled in. It was here and staying, and had been going for about 2-3 years now. Unemployment by 1932 was about 25%. 25. That means 1 out of every 4 adult working person could not find a job. And if you were African American or Mexican American, it was harder. Right? If you were a minority in the United States, it was actually, the unemployment rate was actually worse for minorities than it was for white people. But the average unemployment, 25%. To give you an idea of what it is right now, normal unemployment when the economy is good is about 4 to 6%. that's usually just people like looking for jobs who might be out of work for the moment. During the previous recession that we just kind of got through about a decade ago, 2008, 2009, 2010, the unemployment rate was about 10% at its worst. 10%. That's already high. In this time period, 1932, 25%. Just mind-blowing unemployment. And so, lots of people are struggling, right? It's not just the bankers or the day laborers, it's everybody. And so, a group gets together, and it's a group of World War I veterans. And that's who the Bonus Army is. So, it's a group of veterans who are going to converge on Washington to protest Hoover. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about here, is this group of veterans that they all converge on Washington, D.C., and they're protesting Hoover's policies. So let me set the background here. So, in 1924, this it's about 6 years after World War I, Congress passed a law that gave World War I veterans a bonus of about $1,000. But the idea was that you couldn't get that bonus in 1924. You actually had to wait. So in 1924, they gave them the bonus of $1,000, but you couldn't get it yet. You had to wait until 1945, and then you'd be able to access the bonus. The idea was that that bonus would accrue interest over the years, and by 1945, it would be more than $1,000, and you'd happily take it out almost as like a way to like start settling into retirement, perhaps. Or at the very least, middle age. So the bonus is sitting there gathering interest. And this is the Depression, right? We're in the 1930s now, 1932, and veterans are struggling. World War I veterans are having a tough time making money just like everybody else. But they know they have that bonus sitting in the bank, just sitting there. And so a bunch of veterans get together and think, why don't we try to march to Washington and get our bonuses early? And so they start off in Portland, Oregon, and they march all the way across the nation, and pick up steam as they go. Like, more people start joining them. By the time they get to Washington, D.C., you can see here, there's a lot of them. About 40,000 people, in fact, in this march. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, which was a play on like the World War I group, the expeditionary force that went over and fought in Europe. So they called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, and landed in Washington, D.C. There's 40,000 of them. In terms of how many veterans, is about 20,000. So about half of the 40,000 was actual veterans. The others, women and children, right? Wives, families. So they set up this big camp. You can see it right here on your screen, that they have this big camp set up literally right outside of the Capitol. It's just on the southeast part of town, southeast part of Washington, D.C. And they're there. 40,000 people just descended into Washington and are petitioning the government for their bonuses. Okay. So, what is Hoover going to do about this? What is the government going to do? All of a sudden, there's all these veterans, like, they have to figure out what's going on. So the House of Representatives puts forward a plan that says, yes, let's give the veterans their bonuses. They pass it. It goes up to the Senate, and the Senate says, nope, no bonuses. So the bill to give these veterans their bonuses is defeated. And to make matters worse, Herbert Hoover refused to meet with the veterans. He was not interested in meeting with the leadership. He didn't meet with any of the veterans, and that made him appear callous, like he didn't care about these veterans who were clearly struggling. And then to make matters worse, in the summer of 1932, after the Bonus Army had been there, for a few months now, Hoover sends in the military to literally clear out the camp. So he sends in the army and some police to literally force the veterans out of Washington, D.C. Troops roll in. They actually set the buildings, the shanty town, on fire. They used tear gas to try to disperse the crowds, and you can see the police coming in here using some pretty rough tactics. One infant actually perished during all of this. And this bottom picture, I think, is especially powerful because you can see the flames here of the shanty town, and then the Washington Monument in the background there. But so Hoover literally, not only did the Congress and the president refused to meet with these people, refused to give them their bonuses. Then they used violence to kick the World War I veterans out of Washington. And so for many people, they were like, this is it. This is the last straw. Like, I can't believe that this president is that cruel, that heartless. And so it really is going to harden people's opinion against Hoover. People are going to turn on Hoover and view him as a bad president. And in fact, that same year, 1932, is an election year. And so this happens in July. Literally just 5 months later, there's an election, and Hoover is going to get absolutely destroyed in that election by Franklin Roosevelt. So the bonus army and all of the problems of the Great Depression just obliterate Hoover's presidency. Like, Hoover becomes known as the Depression president. And in fact, we'll talk more about the 1932 election next time, but the 1932 election ends Republican dominance. The Republican Party, with the exception of Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms, had dominated American politics for about 36 years. And so in 1932, because of the Depression, now you have the Democrats coming into office. And so the Depression's really, really powerful, not just socially, but electorally. So let's talk a little bit about, we've been dealing a lot with politics and the economy and how the government is responding to the Depression. Let's talk about how people are struggling during the Depression. And we're going to be going out west and south, talking about farmers. So we're going to be talking about the Dust Bowl and how people were struggling in the West, the South, and we're talking agrarian America, right? Because farmers did not experience the economic boom of the 1920s the way everybody else did, right? As the stock market was going up, as people in the cities were experiencing the jazz lifestyle and all these new technologies and electricity coming into the cities, people out on farms in Middle America were struggling mightily. Let me show you a graph here. Now we're paying attention to this graph right here on the left, and you can see that in the 20s, right, the prices of these things, by the time you get to the Depression, are already kind of on the downswing here. And then during the Depression, it gets even worse. And so what's happening is that farmers were having trouble selling their crops. This goes all the way back, in fact, to World War I. In World War I, American farmers did really well because Europe needed food, right? They needed food to feed their troops, to feed their families, and so American farmers were selling their goods overseas during World War I. But then, as Europe starts recovering from World War I, American farmers all of a sudden aren't able to sell their goods as easily, aren't able to sell their crops as easily, and so they start struggling. The amount of crops now available in the world as Europe recovered drives prices down, and that means that people are not making as much money. And so farmers are struggling, and many of them actually end up selling their farms. You can see right here in this graph that they had to renegotiate their mortgages sometimes because they just could not make ends meet. Many of the people who were struggling, lived in like either the Deep South or the Great Plains. And I can show you some pictures here. This was in Alabama. A guy named let me flip my notes here. A guy named Walker Evans took this picture, and he actually took a series of pictures like this, where he basically went down to Alabama and went to a county, Hale County, and took pictures of working class families, sharecropping families. They grew cotton down in the South. And so these are sharecroppers, right? Those folks that we talked about way back when we talked about Reconstruction. And, these pictures like this, illustrate the poverty of the Great Depression. How these families just don't really have much. Walker Evans went into these folks' house, took pictures. I mean, they have like one bed, maybe 2 beds, for the kids. Kids are sharing a bed. They just don't own a lot of stuff. And you can see that, their clothes haven't been washed, right? So it's a rough environment down in the Deep South. And so, why is this happening? What is causing this struggle? So let's go back just a little bit in time to the 19th century. So we're talking like 1850s to 1870s, 1880s. And back in that time period, people were moving into the Midwest slash like Great Plains region of the country because it was a really wet time period, meaning there was a lot of rain. And so the Great Plains has really good soil for growing crops. And because of the rain, people were like, this is amazing. Like, I've never had this much crop before. But the problem is that the Great Plains is actually kind of arid. It is a semi-arid environment, so that it doesn't get a ton of rain, but people believe that, well, the climate had just changed, and now we're going to be getting a lot of rain. And so during those really wet seasons, people were growing an amazing amount of crops. But by the 1920s, 1930s, that all that rain had dried up, and people were struggling again, right? They weren't able to make as many crops. And people didn't rotate their crops either. Crop rotation is something that people do in the modern era to prevent their soil from getting exhausted, right? Because anytime you grow crops, you're taking the nutrients out of the soil. And if you grow crops on the same piece of land year after year after year, it's going to exhaust the nutrients. And so you really ideally should have, like a few fields, and you grow here and leave this one fallow, right? Don't grow on it. And then you rotate, right? Every year. So that way there's always one field that is not being grown on so that it can like kind of recuperate nutrients. But people weren't doing that. People weren't rotating their crops because they wanted to maximize how many crops they could grow, right? Because they were like, well, if we're already struggling to make money, if we grow fewer crops, then we're just basically shooting ourselves in the foot, right? We won't be able to make any money on this. So the crops are getting more exhausted, the soil is getting exhausted. People are struggling to sell their crops. And then by 1930, a huge drought sets in. And this is where we get to the Dust Bowl, right? Because a drought is really just a dry season that then extends into multiple years, right? Or multiple months. And so during 1930 and then beyond, into the mid-30s even, there is just this years-long drought where there's just no rain. And it starts in the east, on the east coast, and then extends into the west, into the southeast. And people are struggling. It's a nationwide problem. Because farmers, if you remember, were already struggling to sell their crops. And now they can't even grow crops. Right, so it just exacerbates their problems, right? It magnifies the issues that people like this family right here are dealing with. Because at first they're just like barely making any money selling their crops, and now they can't even grow crops. Some places during the Dust Bowl received virtually no rain. Now I know to us in Houston that seems like impossible because it just always rains here. But really, I'm talking no rain. And so what starts to happen is these massive dust storms called black blizzards. That's a real picture. That's not from a movie. That is not like a movie set or like, a picture of Mars. That is an actual picture from Spearman, Texas in 1935 of a massive dust storm blowing in. And if you've ever been up to West Texas, like the Panhandle area or into Oklahoma or New Mexico, these dust storms are actually not that uncommon. Now, the black blizzards were huge, big dust storms, and they were caused by the drought because the drought affected all of the Great Plains, particularly like Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma, and because of the drought, the soil was very brittle, right? It was cracked, and wind across the Great Plains just whips through. It's very, very windy up there. And so as the wind would blow, it would pick up little pieces of dirt, fling it into the air, until eventually you get these massive dust storms, like the one that you see in this picture here. And so it was very dry, extreme heat, and then that produced these massive dust storms. And you can see this is that quote there. John Steinbeck is an author who wrote a very famous book. Many of you may have read it in high school. I did as a junior. And it's called The Grapes of Wrath, and it talks about a journey that I believe the family is the Joad family. It's a novel, so it's fiction. but he's talking about this family that has to leave their farm in, I believe, Oklahoma, and travel west to escape the drought. And he talks, John Steinbeck here talks about the black blizzards and how they affected people. And it says, houses were shut tight and cloth wedged around doors and windows, but the dust came in so thinly that it could not be seen in the air, and it settled like pollen on the chairs and tables, on the dishes. If you've ever lived anywhere that's dusty, like Lubbock, Amarillo, up in the northern panhandle of Texas, this is so true. I haven't lived in Lubbock for a decade, and I still open boxes and find things covered in dust. And I'm not talking like the dust that accumulates on your fan. I'm talking like red, earthy dust from dust storms. It's crazy. And during this time period, these dust storms were absolutely huge. Now, to give you an example of like how big I'm talking about, there was one day called Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. And it was a massive dust storm that went all the way from Idaho to Kansas, covering like 3 states. Some of the dust even traveled all the way to the East Coast, right? I don't know how they figured that out, but they did. Somebody did some studying of some dust. And the problem is, I'm going to go back a few slides here. The problem is this. Look at this picture. This is what dust storms do to cropland. They take a bunch of dirt, basically, and then just put it on top of the cropland here. You can tell it would be very difficult to grow any sort of crop on this land now. It's just unusable almost. And so what happens is, these black blizzards devastate farmland, right? People cannot grow crops anymore because the topsoil where you plant the crop has eroded away, or it's exhausted because of overplanting. And so millions of people actually are forced to leave their homes. Like they have to leave Oklahoma and North Texas because they just can't live there anymore. If they stay there, they die. So people had to leave. And they often went west. People from the devastated plains area pack up everything and move west. They're oftentimes called Okies. Even if they weren't from Oklahoma, that's just what they got called because so many people had to leave Oklahoma during the drought, during the Dust Bowl. And so all these people who are pushing west just generally get called Okies. And they push west because they were following tales of economic opportunity. If you read The Grapes of Wrath, the John Steinbeck book that you just heard the quote from, the book is about this, is about a family that literally just, as you can see here, packs up all their belongings, puts it on their car, and then is pushing west. And they're looking for economic opportunity, in whatever form that might take. And people who had cars were lucky. They could at least drive. Some people just hitchhiked the whole way, right? They couldn't drive, didn't own a car. And so they would literally just pack up their suitcase or a bag, sling it over their shoulder, off they went. And I love this picture right here because you get these 2 gentlemen right here who are, clearly, basically they have their clothes on their back and whatever's in their bag. But you have it juxtaposed next to this sign right here that says, next time, try the train, and relax. No big deal. But obviously we're talking about intense poverty, right? These people can't afford to take the train. These people own no land, and it was really difficult going out to California. Oftentimes people were living very itinerant lifestyles, meaning they were moving from place to place to place in search for economic opportunity. And because there were so many people doing this, what happens is people are often working for like starvation wages. They would come to a farm and the farmer would, offer them a job, but he wouldn't pay them very well, or he would not pay them at all and instead give them credit to use at the local store that he also happened to own, almost as like a sharecropping thing, right? To kind of keep these people indebted rather than having to pay them an actual wage. So people are just starving out west. And we're talking intense poverty here. And one of the most famous photographers of the era is a woman here. You can see her up in the upper left there, Dorothy Lang. and she took a series of photos. Like, she was a journalist, a photojournalist from San Francisco. And so she owned a photography studio, but then when she heard of all these migrants who were pushing west and struggling and starving, she decided that she wanted to go and capture it, right? To go and study these migrants, take pictures of them in an effort to kind of like tell their story. And so she goes out there, and the most famous series of pictures she takes is of this family right here. This is the mom right here. Her name is Florence Owens Thompson. You don't need to know her name. But she's 32 years old. She has 7 kids. 7 kids. And they literally, if you can't really see it here, but this in the back is their car that they have then turned into kind of a tent. They've sold the tires to try to eat food. They ran out of gas. And so literally they're stuck on the side of the road with nowhere to go. The way they survived was the children here would go out and scavenge for, like, you know, just things that might be growing in the ground, or berries, or maybe like to catch an animal of some kind. The most famous picture that Dorothy Lang took is this one right here. You may have even seen this before. It's a very, very famous image. And that's Florence Owens Thompson, the same mother from the previous picture. And this picture is called The Migrant Mother. And, you know, these pictures were published in, you know, newspapers and magazines. And what it did was it illustrated the struggle of farmers, the struggle of people living in agrarian America that were, you know, in intense poverty during the Great Depression. I mean, you can see it in her face, right? Like the worry, fear, anxiety is just etched in the lines in her face, right? And think about it, she's only 32 in this image, but she looks like the worries of the Great Depression have worn her down in many ways. And so, you know, this is what the Depression was like, right? Was those sharecroppers I showed you in that picture earlier down in Hale County, Alabama. This mother and her 7 children stuck on the side of the road, struggling to make ends meet. You have the Hoovervilles outside of big cities, right? People are legitimately struggling during this era. And so what are the legacies of the Great Depression? Well, obviously it was an economic catastrophe, right? That it was a catastrophic event for the American economy. People are losing jobs. Some people, you know, lose their lives. During the Dust Bowl, 4,500 people died, I believe, in 1 year. In 1936, 4,500 people died as a result of the Dust Bowl because of the starvation, the heat, and sometimes even like the dust, right, could get in your lungs and cause health problems. And so another legacy of the Great Depression is not just the bad economy, but it's the fact that it displaces people. People literally had to uproot and go to a different part of the country just to try to survive. Now, politically, this ushers in a new president, right? Hoover is increasingly blamed for the Depression, and so he's going to lose in 1932. And this man right here, holding his hat up, that is New Yorker Franklin Roosevelt. He is going to become president in 1932, and then he will actually serve more terms than any American president ever. He gets elected 4 times, which we'll talk about later. Obviously that can't happen nowadays. We have changed the Constitution since then. But so Americans turn against Hoover. They turn against the Republican Party. You know, people are angry about this idea of like rugged individualism. They were angry that the government seemed to not care that they were struggling. And so Hoover's going to lose to Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt will become the president for numerous years after this. And with Roosevelt, we're going to enter a new era of American politics. Like the New Deal is going to happen, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. And so for now, that's all I have for you guys today. So I hope you'd enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys in class.